Thank you so much, Esther. Wow, that was awesome. So really, and something that I hadn't expected to talk about, which I'm only going to mention for a moment, was the experience I had when Esther was asking us to document, which was about, when we were moving back and forth, and I was reminded of the foundation of somatic experiencing that people are familiar. That's a very well-known trauma therapy that's based on, some of which was developed by looking at how animals respond to trauma. Oh, sorry. Which was developed based on research that was sort of exploring how animals respond to trauma by shaking it out of their bodies. So somatic experiencing was which is a well-known somatic trauma therapy, was actually based on that idea that we need to move our bodies, that trauma is stored in the body and needs to be dealt with in sort of a bodily way. So I just was thinking about that when you had, when you gave that demonstration. So I just kind of wanted to talk about a little bit offer some case examples from my own practice. And interestingly enough, I was thinking oh wow, I need to think if I have any children, if I've worked with any children of Holocaust survivors, because that's an example of when you often see transgenerational trauma. In fact, there's been a variety of research studies showing that there's an epigenetic foundation behind the transmission of trauma, that it affects the children on a hormonal level. And in the 1960s in Canada, there's a very famous research study that showed that there was about they just noticed that there was an extraordinary influx of children of Holocaust survivors who were seeking services, and they started to explore more about how trauma is transmitted from one generation to another. And traditionally, it was thought of being transmitted behaviorally and psychologically, but now it is that they're actually discovering that there is some maybe genetic component, which is kind of interesting. But I actually didn't have, interestingly enough, I was thinking about, I didn't have any children of Holocaust survivors in my practice, or I couldn't remember any that I've seen, at least in the last 5 years, that came readily to mind. But I had an experience this week of working with a woman who, a young woman, a 19-year-old woman, who was recently referred to me. I've seen her maybe a handful of times from the Orthodox community. And this, I think, is a pretty good example of how, what Ezra was sort of saying, that the tools are available in the tradition, but it often gets lost, especially in more of the rigid, law-based world of Orthodoxy. And I don't want to bash Orthodoxy, because I actually had adventures in exploring that world myself, and there's a lot of beautiful things about it. But in the more isolated, or the more, what's the word I'm looking for? Insulated, thank you. Insulated communities, a lot of what Esther was talking about in terms of not speaking it, saying gossip, or kind of airing your dirty laundry, and also the idea of not being able to feel like you can fully explore your own individuality in a safe way if it goes against the laws, can be very traumatizing for some. So just an example, I have a 19-year-old woman who was referred to me by the sister of a friend of mine from Romamu, who left the Orthodox community. And she is, she's one of 6 children. She's, I think, the second to the youngest. And she, her mother was both verbally and physically abusive to her. She was molested by her brother. Comes from a very dysfunctional family, and she wants out. She wants to get out of the community. And one of the ways that also the Jewish community does tend to respond to trauma is by organizing. So one of the things that I did do is refer her to an organization called Footsteps, which was created to help Jews in the Orthodox communities who want to transition out of that world, to find ways to have like work with mental health professionals who help them find their way and transition from that world into the secular world, by giving them a support system, by dealing with helping them process their trauma. And I referred her to Footsteps while I continue to work with her individually, and I wanted her to specifically to do a Footsteps group because I thought that she needed a support system as she's leaving her community, that she needed a support system to support her. And she's been acting out. She's been having sex with random people. And again, this is a new relationship. But she's while she's extremely depressed and anxious, she's also extremely insightful. And we were talking the other day, and she told me how happy she was that she went to a Footsteps brunch, like with some other people that were part of, who had left the community, and how reassuring it was to her to see that you could leave and still have a support system. But I was talking to her, and I said to her, you know, your journey, it's so interesting, your journey is so intrinsically Jewish. I said, like, think about the story of Jacob, right? He comes from this really dysfunctional family where after he betrays, you know, he like steals the blessing from his brother, and then his, you know, and like deceives his father. You know, his brother wants to kill him, and he has to leave his whole familial environment and go to this new place, like to leave and be by himself in the wilderness on his way to an uncle. And how much courage it takes to, and I said even Abraham had to, like, you know, forswear idols. So this path of leaving, of having the courage to leave something behind, to take that risk, to leave your familiar environment, and in the middle of that transitional liminal space of being in that no man's land, you encounter God, right? Because Jacob on the road to Beersheba had an experience where he encountered God and said, God was in this place and I didn't know. And meanwhile, this woman does believe in God. And she's, something else I wanted to say, she's also identifies, well, she's trying to figure out how she identifies, but she's having sex with both women and men. And so I said, you know, having this experience is a very Jewish experience, and and when I framed it that way, she said, wow, like, I would never think of it that way. It's just not how it's presented to me. So that kind of, I think, testifies to what Esther's saying. Even more so, I think she would be surprised to hear of all the things that Esther shared with us today in terms of what's available in the tradition. You know, and so for her, and it was also really very interesting because she said, when she went to this brunch, she said, yeah, they said that they're going to have a Shabbat dinner. And meanwhile, she will tell you, like, I hate Shabbat. She'll be, I hate the whole idea of Shabbat. But this idea of being able, there's something about that, having that being able to have something that's sort of familiar and comforting to be, like, for her to be able to transition into a new life and yet still be able to have those sort of supports and retain her identity felt sort of meaningful to her. So I thought that was an interesting example.